want to tell you something before I begin. This is not a news report. It is not a court document. It is not a headline. It is a story, and I am telling it as a story because sometimes a story is the only way to say the thing that has been sitting in your chest for months, pressing against your ribs, quietly asking to be let out. The names in this story are part of the telling. The feelings behind it, though, those are real. Those belong to every mother who has ever looked at her child across a room and thought, something is wrong, and then been told she was imagining things. If that sounds familiar to you, stay with me. I think you may need to hear this. I found the message on my phone at 6:42 in the evening on a Tuesday in March of 2026. I was standing in my kitchen on Blackstone Grove in Providence, Rhode Island, with my hands still damp from washing the good china. I had been separating the old dishes from the everyday ones, something I do every few months when my mind starts wandering toward the quiet. 78 years old, and I still find comfort in the weight of a ceramic plate. There is something honest about a dish. It does not pretend to be more than it is. My phone was sitting on the counter beside the dish rack, screen facing up, and when it lit, I almost did not look. I was expecting a reminder from the pharmacy about a prescription refill, or maybe a message from my neighbor Dolores asking if I wanted company for supper. What I was not expecting was a pin on a map and 4 sentences from my daughter Grace. Mom, come now. Bring clean clothes. Do not call anyone. Room 12. I stood there for a moment with a soup bowl in my hands, and I read those words 3 times. Not because they were hard to understand, because something in my body understood them too quickly, and my mind needed a few extra seconds to catch up with what my chest already knew. This was not the message of a daughter who had locked her keys in her car. This was not the message of a daughter who needed a ride from a dinner that had run too late. This was the message of someone who had been holding on for a very long time and had finally found a small enough crack in the wall to push 1 sentence through. I set the bowl down. I did not dry my hands. I picked up my coat from the hook by the back door, the old gray wool one that Grace used to say made me look like a professor, and I walked out to my car without turning off the kitchen light. The address on the pin was the Bayfront Motor Lodge. I knew the road. It was on the edge of the city, out past the commercial strip where the gas stations and the storage units and the used furniture places crowded together along the asphalt. I had driven past it dozens of times over the years without ever stopping. It had a sign out front with a few letters missing, a parking lot with faded yellow lines, and curtains in the windows that were always half pulled. Not a dangerous place. Not a glamorous one. Just a place that had been quietly useful to people who needed somewhere to be for a few hours, without explaining why. I want to pause right here for just a moment, because I want to know something. If you are listening to this right now, will you tell me where you are? What city? What state? What time of day is it there? I like knowing I am not carrying this alone. If this story is already touching something in you, leave a like so I know to keep telling it. And if you have not subscribed yet, please do. There is a new story here every single day, and some of them are going to reach somebody right when they need it most. Now let me take you back to that road. I drove slowly. I am not ashamed of that. My hands were steady on the wheel, but my heart was moving faster than the speed limit. And I have learned at my age that when your heart is racing, the best thing your hands can do is move carefully. The city was doing what cities do at 6:42 on a Tuesday evening in March. People were coming home from work with their faces turned toward the ground. A pizza place had its lights on, orange and warm. A child in a red jacket was being pulled along the sidewalk by a dog that had somewhere important to be. Providence in the early evening has a particular kind of tired beauty, and usually I find it comforting. That night, I did not see any of it. I was already inside room 12 in my mind, already trying to prepare myself for whatever I was about to find, which is something a mother does automatically, this terrible quiet rehearsal, even when she has no idea what the script contains. The Bayfront Motor Lodge was exactly as I remembered it from the outside. The parking lot had only 4 cars in it. The lobby had a small lamp in the window and a handwritten sign about checkout times. I did not go through the lobby. The pin on the map had taken me directly to the side of the building, and the rooms had their own doors facing the parking lot, the kind of old motel design where every room opens directly to the outside air. No hallways, no carpeted corridors, just a concrete walkway and a row of identical brown doors with brass numbers. Room 12 was at the far end. I want to tell you about that walk. It was not long, maybe 40 feet of concrete, but it felt like something I would remember for the rest of my life. The air smelled like exhaust and cold rain and the particular metallic smell of a parking lot in early spring. A light above one of the rooms was flickering. My shoes made a sound on the concrete that seemed too loud for how quietly I was trying to move. I counted the door numbers as I passed them. 8, 9, 10, 11, and then 12. I knocked twice. There was a silence that lasted just long enough for me to feel it in my stomach, and then I heard the click of a lock being turned, and the door opened, and there was my daughter. Grace Foster was 32 years old and had been, for most of her life, the kind of person who filled a room without trying. She had her father's eyes, dark and steady, and she had my mother's way of standing, straight-backed and composed, even in situations that called for falling apart. She was an interior designer, good at her work, known in the professional community around Providence for a particular kind of taste that was elegant without being cold. She had built a small business over 8 years, client by client, project by project. She had a reputation for being someone who understood space, who understood how a room should feel, not just how it should look. The woman who opened the door of room 12 was wearing a coat that was too large for her. Not in the charming way of a woman who has borrowed something comfortable. In the way of a person who has been wearing the wrong size for so long that she no longer notices. Her hair was pulled back simply. She was not wearing anything that indicated she had planned to be seen that day. She was holding a canvas tote bag against her side, one of those sturdy ones with stiff handles, and it was full. I could see the edges of papers pressing against the fabric from the inside. She looked at me and did not say hello. She did not open her arms. She stepped back from the door and said, "Come in. Close it behind you." I came in. I closed it behind me. The room was clean in the functional way of budget motel rooms that have been maintained but not renewed in several decades. There was a bed with a floral spread in muted burgundy and beige. There was a small table with 2 chairs and a lamp with a shade that had gone slightly yellow at the edges. There was a television bolted to the dresser that was not on. On the table there was a paper cup of coffee that had gone cold, and beside it a bottle of water and a small notepad with nothing written on it. The curtains were drawn. Not dramatically drawn, not desperately drawn. Just closed, the way a person closes a curtain when they want the world to wait outside for a while. Grace sat on the edge of the bed. She put the tote bag beside her and pressed her hands flat on her knees, and she looked at me for a long moment before she said anything. "I did not call you for a rescue," she said. "I called you because I needed a witness. There is a difference. I need you to understand that before I say anything else." I sat down in one of the chairs by the table. "All right," I said. "I understand." She looked at her hands. She looked at the bag. She looked at the curtain. And then she said the sentence that I have turned over in my mind every single day since. "He did not ruin me all at once. He made me sign one thing at a time." I want to tell you something I have come to understand in the 78 years I have been alive on this particular earth. There is a kind of destruction that does not look like destruction while it is happening. It does not come through a door swinging open with force. It comes quietly, formally, with a pen in someone's hand and a reasonable explanation for why this signature is necessary, why this account transfer makes sense, why this document is just a formality, why you are overreacting if you hesitate, why the hesitation itself is proof that you do not trust the person who loves you. That kind of destruction is patient. It is organized. And by the time the person inside it begins to understand what has been built around them, the structure is already complete. I did not know any of that yet. Not fully. I knew my daughter, and I knew that the woman sitting on the edge of that bed had been disappearing for the better part of a year, and that everyone in our family had been watching it happen and calling it by the wrong names. Grace began to talk. She talked the way a person talks when they have been quiet for so long that the words have to find their shape again before they can come out clearly. Slowly at first. Then with a kind of controlled steadiness that told me she had rehearsed this, not to deceive me, but because she had practiced it in the mirror or in her own mind enough times to know that if she lost her composure before she finished, she might not find the courage to start again. She told me about Caleb. Caleb Mercer was her husband of 4 years. He was 41 years old, tall, good-looking in a way that was easy to trust, with a professional manner and a social warmth that made people comfortable in his presence immediately. He worked in financial consulting, or presented himself as working in financial consulting, which Grace told me that evening was a distinction she had taken far too long to examine. He had clients. He had an office downtown, an address I knew, a building I had driven past without suspicion. He had attended dinner at my kitchen table on Sundays for 4 years, and he had always brought a bottle of something thoughtful, always kissed my cheek, always helped clear the plates. Grace said, "The first time he asked me to sign something, I thought it was for a shared account. He explained it carefully. He had a way of explaining things that made you feel like your hesitation was the problem, not the thing he was explaining." She paused. "The second time, it was a business loan, in my name, for his venture," he said. "A partnership he was forming. He said my credit profile was stronger. He said it would only be for a short time. He said it was the kind of thing couples do." I want to stop right here, because what Grace said next is the part that I believe someone listening tonight may need to hear, not as a story about herself, as a reflection about their own life. She said, "Every single time there was a reason that sounded like love. And I believed the reasons because I loved him, and because I thought that love meant trusting the explanations." I learned that afternoon in room 12 that financial control inside a relationship is rarely announced. It does not arrive as a demand. It arrives as a request dressed in the language of partnership, practicality, and affection. And by the time the person inside it understands what has accumulated, the signatures are already on the pages, the accounts are already linked, the liability is already legal, and the person who created the structure is already holding the exit door open on their side only. Before I go any further, I want to take a breath with you. If you are still here, if you have been listening, will you do something for me? Tell me what time it is where you are. Morning or evening? What city? I like knowing who is out there. If this story is giving you something to think about, leave a like. It helps more people find these stories, and some of those people may need them in ways neither of us can predict. Subscribe if you want to be here tomorrow, because tomorrow there is another story waiting. Now let me go back to that room. Grace opened the tote bag. Inside were papers, not a few papers. Organized papers, sorted into sections held together with small binder clips, the way a person organizes documents when they have been living inside a system long enough to understand its architecture. Bank statements, printed emails. A copy of a business registration form with her name as sole proprietor of an entity she told me she had never agreed to open. A lease agreement on a commercial space signed in her handwriting for a property she had never visited. Loan documents with her signature on the bottom line, 4 of them, totaling an amount that made me hold very still when she said the number. And then she reached to the bottom of the bag and pulled out a different kind of document. It was a list of names, typed, not handwritten, a column of names on the left, a column of notations on the right. She set it on the table between us and looked at me and said, "He did not do this alone." The room was very quiet. The flickering light outside was still flickering. Somewhere far down the parking lot, a car door closed. I looked at the list. I recognized a name. I want to be precise about what I mean when I say the room changed. The room did not change. The lamp was still yellow. The curtain was still closed. The cold cup of coffee was still on the table. What changed was something inside my chest, a kind of structural rearrangement, the way a building shifts after a tremor. Not collapsing, rearranging, making room for a new understanding of what it had been built on. The name I recognized was someone who came to my kitchen on Sundays, someone who passed the bread, someone who said they loved Grace like their own, someone who knew things about our family that a person can only know if they have been trusted completely, over years, at close range. Grace said, "I found out 3 days ago. That is why I am here. That is why I sent you the location instead of coming home. Because home is a place where that person has a key." I have been a mother for 32 years. I have been a widow for 11. I have been a woman who thought she understood the geography of her own family well enough to navigate it in the dark. What I understood in that moment, sitting across from my daughter in room 12 of the Bayfront Motor Lodge, was that the map I had been using was someone else's drawing, and the territory had always been different from the picture. I reached across the table and I put my hand over hers. She did not pull away. "Tell me everything," I said. "From the beginning, slowly. I am not going anywhere." And she did. Before I tell you what Grace told me in that room, I want to take you back for a moment. Back before that Tuesday in March. Back to the months that came before it, because the story of Room 12 does not begin in Room 12. It begins much earlier, in the ordinary afternoons of a family that looked from the outside like it was doing fine. I have lived on Blackstone Grove in Providence for 31 years. My husband Walter and I bought the house in the late 1990s when the neighborhood was quieter than it is now, when you could park on the street without planning your arrival time carefully, and when the oak tree in the front yard was still young enough that its roots had not yet begun their slow, patient argument with the sidewalk. Walter died 11 years ago. Lung disease, slow and then sudden, the way those things tend to go. After he passed, the house became something different for me. Not a sad place, but a place with a different kind of weight. The rooms kept his measurements. The kitchen still knew the sound of his chair. I kept myself busy in the ways available to a woman of 78 who is in reasonable health and not willing to become invisible. I cooked. I tended the garden in the warmer months, nothing ambitious, tomatoes and herbs, and the old rose bushes that Walter planted, and that I had never had the heart to remove. I went to St. Augustine's on Sunday mornings, not out of obligation, but out of something I would describe as companionship with a longer story than my own. I visited my neighbor Dolores in the evenings, and she visited me, and we watched old films and argued about whether the second cup of coffee after 7 in the evening was worth the cost, and we always decided that it was. And every Sunday, Grace came to dinner. That was the arrangement we had built over the years, through her 20s and then into her marriage. Sunday dinner at my table, sometimes with Caleb, sometimes when his schedule made it inconvenient, without him. I always made something that required time, a roast or a slow soup or a pasta that needed the sauce to be built from scratch over the course of the afternoon, because I had learned that a meal worth waiting for creates a different kind of conversation than a meal assembled quickly. People settle in differently when they can smell what is coming. In the early years of Grace and Caleb's marriage, those Sundays were full. She talked about her projects, about the clients she was working with, about the particular challenges of transforming a space that someone else had built without thinking about how a person would actually live inside it. She had strong opinions about light. She believed that most rooms suffered from not having enough of it, that people underestimated how much their mood was shaped by whether a window faced east or west, whether the curtains were pulling the natural brightness in or pushing it back. I used to tease her about it. I would say, "Grace, not everyone can redesign their life around the position of the sun." And she would laugh and say, "Maybe that is exactly the problem." I have thought about that many times since Room 12. Sometime around the middle of 2025, the Sundays began to change. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself. Grace still came. She still sat at the table. She still answered when I asked her questions, but something in the quality of her presence had shifted. She was there and also somewhere else at the same time, the way a person sits at a table when they are carrying a conversation in their head that they cannot have out loud. I noticed smaller things. She stopped telling stories about her work. When I asked how a particular project was going, a renovation she had mentioned proudly the month before, she said it had been put on hold. When I asked about another client, she said things had changed. She was vague in a way that was new for her. Grace had always been precise about her opinions, precise about her plans. This new vagueness had a texture to it, like a deliberate smoothing over, like someone who has learned that details can become evidence and so has stopped offering them. She ate less. I noticed that. Not dramatically less, but the kind of less that a mother notices because she has been watching a person eat for 32 years and she knows the difference between a small appetite and an appetite being managed. She started leaving things on her plate. She would say she was not that hungry. She would say she had eaten late the day before. The explanations were always reasonable. That was the thing about all of it. Every single change had a reasonable explanation, and if you took each one separately, it dissolved before you could hold it. There was also a change in how she held her phone. I know that sounds like a small detail, but I am 78 years old, and I have learned to pay attention to small details because the large ones are always made of small ones. Grace had always been comfortable with her phone. She set it on the table during meals without thinking about it. She answered it in front of me without anxiety. But somewhere in that middle stretch of 2025, she began holding it differently. She held it face down. She took it with her when she moved from one room to another. When it buzzed, something in her expression tightened before she looked at it, the way a person braces for something they are expecting but have not yet found a way to stop dreading. I said something to her about it once. It was October, I remember, because the rose bushes had just been cut back for the season, and I was still a little sad about it the way I always am. I said, "Is everything all right with you, honey? You seem a little somewhere else lately." And she looked at me with a smile that was perfectly shaped and said, "I am just tired, Mom. Work has been hectic." And I nodded, because what else can you do when the answer is delivered with such steady calm? You cannot say, "I do not believe you." Not without something more than a feeling. But I kept it. I kept the feeling the way I keep things I am not yet ready to examine. I put it in a pocket inside my chest, and I carried it forward through October and November and into December, and it stayed there, quiet and present, like a pebble in a shoe that you have learned to walk with because stopping to remove it does not feel possible yet. I want to pause here because I want to ask you something directly. Have you ever watched someone you love disappear in small pieces and been told that you were imagining it, that you were overreacting, that you were too close to see clearly? If you have ever felt that, write the word "listen" in the comments. Just that one word. And if you are here for the first time, welcome. Subscribe so you do not miss tomorrow's story. Every day there is one waiting for you, and every one of them is told from the heart. Now let me go back to Grace. Christmas came and went. Grace was present for the holiday, but she arrived late and left early, which was new. Caleb did not come at all. She said he had commitments elsewhere, and she said it with the particular flatness of someone delivering a line they have rehearsed because the original true version was too complicated to explain in a doorway. I gave her a gift I had wrapped carefully, a book about architectural history I had found in a shop downtown because she had mentioned the author once over dinner, and she held it against her chest and closed her eyes for just a moment. And I did not know then what I know now about why that small gesture made her cry, quietly, with her face turned toward the window. January was when I began to keep notes. I am not a suspicious woman by nature. I do not like the version of myself that watches and records. But I had spent too many months carrying something I could not name, and at a certain point, the weight of an unnamed thing becomes heavier than the discomfort of naming it. So I started writing things down. Not accusations, not theories, just observations, dated, kept in a small notebook I tucked under the bread box where I keep the things that I need to find, but do not want to display. January the 9th. Grace called to cancel Sunday dinner, said she had a deadline, did not offer to reschedule. January the 17th. Grace came for coffee, but not dinner. Was distracted throughout. Left before the coffee was finished. Left her scarf on my chair. January the 23rd. Tried to call Grace at 9 in the evening. Phone rang 8 times and then went to voicemail. She called back the next morning and said she had been asleep. January the 28th. Grace came to dinner, ate very little. When I asked about a client she had been excited about in November, she said the contract had fallen through. She did not elaborate. When Caleb's name came up in passing, she looked at the tablecloth. I kept writing through February. The scarf she had left on my chair in January, I kept it there. I do not know exactly why. It felt like something I should not move yet. Something that still contained her, a little, now. I need to tell you about the person on that list, because this is where the story becomes something harder than a wife caught in a bad marriage. This is where it becomes a lesson about the particular cruelty of betrayal that wears the face of family. The name Grace showed me in room 12 was not a stranger's name. It was the name of someone I will call the relative. I will not give more detail than that, because the details belong to a process that was still unfolding when I made my decision about what to tell and what to protect. What I will tell you is this. The relative was someone who had been close to our family for a long time. Someone who had a natural access to conversations, to financial information mentioned over meals, to the particular texture of Grace's professional life, the clients she was having difficulty with, the contracts that had grown complicated, the periods when her business cash flow was uneven. The kind of information that a person shares with family because family is supposed to be the place where information is held safely. Caleb had not found Grace's vulnerabilities on his own. He had been helped. The relative had served as a quiet advisor, Grace explained to me, using a careful word for something that deserved a much harder one. The advisor had helped Caleb understand the architecture of Grace's professional situation well enough to use it. When Grace's company was going through a slow period, the advisor knew. When Grace was anxious about a contract that had gone sideways, the advisor knew. And the advisor had, over the course of what appeared to be more than 2 years, used that knowledge to help Caleb construct a situation in which Grace could be made to feel that her signature on documents was the only way forward, that her cooperation was loyalty, that her resistance would only make the damage worse. Grace said, "He would tell me that if I cooperated now, we could fix it later, that the names on the documents were just administrative, that I was protected because he loved me. And every time I almost said no, something would happen that reminded me how much I had already signed, how far in I already was, as if the depth of the hole was proof I should keep digging." That is a sentence I want you to hold for a moment. The depth of the hole was proof she should keep digging. That is how coercive control operates when it is financial and psychological and dressed in the language of partnership. It does not hold a person down with force. It holds a person down with the accumulated weight of everything they have already agreed to. Every previous signature becomes evidence of complicity. Every moment of trust becomes a chain. And the person inside it begins to believe, slowly, quietly, over dozens of cups of coffee and dozens of reasonable explanations, that the way out would cost more than staying. I have spent a lot of time since that evening thinking about what I wish I had understood earlier, about patterns, about what it means when a person who was always precise becomes vague, about what it means when a person starts holding their phone differently, or eating less, or canceling dinners without offering alternatives, about what it means when the explanations are always reasonable and the presence is always partial. I have learned that these are not proof of anything. A person can be tired without being trapped. A person can be private without being afraid. But I have also learned that when you see 4 or 5 or 6 of these things at once, in a person you have known for 32 years, in a person whose baseline you carry in your bones. The right response is not to wait for certainty. The right response is to pay attention, to write things down, to ask the quiet questions. To be the kind of presence that makes a person feel safe enough to eventually open the door of room 12 and step back. Grace had sent me the location because she needed a witness. That was what she said, and I understood it more clearly as the night went on. She was not asking me to rescue her. She had already made the decision to leave the situation. She had already spent 3 days alone in that room, organizing her documents, understanding her liability, calculating what she could prove and what she could only feel. She was not in crisis in the way a person is in crisis when they have no plan. She was in a particular kind of calm that comes after a long period of internal storm, when the decision has finally been made and what remains is only the execution. What she needed from me was not intervention. She needed someone to know. She needed someone to sit across from her in a room with a yellow-edged lampshade and a cold cup of coffee and hear the full account, and not say it was impossible, and not say she should have seen it sooner, and not look at her with that particular expression of discomfort that people wear when the truth is inconvenient for the version of the family they have been maintaining. She needed a mother. I want to tell you something I have learned about being a mother, and I want you to listen carefully because I think it matters beyond this story. Being a mother is not only the warm part. It is not only the feeding and the holding and the showing up with clean clothes in a parking lot at dusk. It is also the hard part. The part where you sit very still while someone you love takes apart a life you thought you understood, and you let them take it apart without trying to reassemble it in a shape that is more comfortable for you. That is the part they do not celebrate. That is the part that costs something. I sat still. I let her talk. And somewhere around 9 in the evening, when the parking lot outside was fully dark and the only sound was the occasional tire on wet asphalt and the faint hum of the vending machine at the far end of the walkway, Grace took the last document out of the tote bag. It was a single page, not a contract, not a bank statement. It was a timeline she had made herself, handwritten in the neat, precise script she had always had, the kind of handwriting that architectural training produces, clear and deliberate and slightly mechanical. It began in the first year of her marriage and ended 3 days ago. It showed every signature, every transfer, every conversation where something had been asked of her, every phone call from the relative, every moment where she had hesitated and been talked past her hesitation. She had made it because she wanted to understand the shape of it. Because when you are inside something, you feel it, but you cannot always see it. She had made the timeline so that the shape would be visible. She set it on the table between us, and she said, "I want you to see what it looks like." I looked at it for a long time. Then I said, "What do you need me to do?" And she said, "I need you to help me figure out the next step, not the whole solution, just the next step. Can you do that?" I told her yes. And that was when I knew that whatever came next was going to require something from me that I had not been asked for in a very long time. Not warmth, not food, not the comfort of a familiar kitchen. It was going to require a different kind of steadiness, the kind that comes not from certainty, but from the decision to keep moving even when you cannot see the whole road. I picked up my coat from the back of the chair. I said, "We are not solving this tonight. Tonight we are getting you somewhere safe, and you are sleeping, and tomorrow we start finding people who can help us do this correctly." Grace looked at me with something in her eyes that I recognized from when she was a child, when she had been frightened of something she did not want to name, and I had sat on the edge of her bed and waited. "Okay," she said. "Okay." I reached into the pocket of my gray wool coat, and I found, by some grace I cannot explain, 2 folded tissues and a piece of hard candy, which is apparently what I carry into every crisis of my life. And Grace looked at it and made a sound that was almost a laugh, and it was the most beautiful sound I had heard in months. We left room 12 at 9:21 in the evening. The parking lot was quiet. The flickering light above room 7 had finally stopped flickering and gone dark. The air was cold and damp and smelled of the ocean, the way Providence smells in March when the wind comes from the right direction, like salt and distance, and the particular patience of water that has been moving for a very long time. I put my daughter in the passenger seat of my car. I put the tote bag in the back, and I sat behind the wheel for a moment before I started the engine, because I needed that moment, just that one, to be a woman who was afraid and did not pretend otherwise before I became the person who was going to drive. Then I started the car, and we moved. I did not sleep that night. I want to be honest about that, because I think honesty is the only thing worth offering when you are telling a story like this one. I brought Grace to my house on Blackstone Grove. I made up the bed in her old room, the one that still had the same curtain rods she had chosen when she was 16, white painted iron with small finials that she had said looked architectural. I brought her a glass of water and a blanket that had been washed so many times it had the texture of something that had given up being new and decided instead to be simply warm. I told her to sleep. She said she would try. I closed the door softly and went back down to my kitchen, and I sat at the table with the light on low, and I did not sleep. The notebook was still under the bread box. I pulled it out, and I opened it to the last entry, which was from 2 weeks before that Tuesday, and I read back through everything I had written since January. All the small observations, all the dates and the canceled dinners and the phone calls that went unanswered, and the half-finished cups of coffee and the scarf still hanging on the chair in the corner of my dining room. And what I had not been able to see when I was writing each individual entry became suddenly and completely visible when I read them all together. The pattern. That is the word I want to give you tonight, the pattern. Because a single observation is just a moment, 2 observations are a coincidence. But 6 months of careful small observations, read in sequence, become something else entirely. They become a shape, and the shape I was looking at in my notebook at 11:45 at night, in my kitchen in Providence in March of 2026, was not the shape of a daughter who was tired. It was the shape of a daughter who had been slowly and systematically removed from her own life. I have lived long enough to understand that the first thing you must do when you see a pattern that frightens you is resist the urge to act immediately from the fear. Fear moves fast and rarely in the right direction. What I needed to do instead was think clearly about what Grace had told me, what the documents in the tote bag meant, and what kind of help would actually be useful rather than simply urgent. She had said she did not want a rescue, she wanted the next step. I wrote that at the top of a fresh page in the notebook, the next step. And underneath it, I began to write what I knew, what I did not know, and what I would need to find out before any intelligent action was possible. What I knew. Grace had signed documents under circumstances that she described as emotionally coercive. Those documents included business loans in her name, a commercial lease, and at least 1 business registration. There was a person in our family circle who had been providing Caleb with information about Grace's professional vulnerabilities. Grace had left the shared home and had been in room 12 of the Bayfront Motor Lodge for 3 days before she contacted me. She had organized her documents. She had made a timeline. She was not in physical danger as far as I could determine. She was in legal and financial danger, which is a different kind of danger, but no less real. What I did not know. The full extent of the liability attached to her name, whether any of the signatures could be challenged, whether there were other documents I had not yet seen, what Caleb's plan was for the immediate future, specifically whether he intended to use Grace's signature on anything else before she could establish distance, and the full nature of the relatives' involvement, whether it was advisory or something more formally complicit, what I needed to find out. Whether there was an attorney who specialized in financial coercion within domestic situations, whether there was a process for documenting what Grace had experienced that would be taken seriously by the appropriate people, and whether Grace herself had already spoken to anyone with professional knowledge of her situation, a counselor, a financial advisor, anyone who could help her understand what her options actually were rather than what Caleb had told her they were. I wrote until nearly 1 in the morning. Then I closed the notebook and put it back under the bread box, and I went and sat in Walter's chair in the living room, which is something I do sometimes when I need to think without thinking, when I need to be somewhere familiar enough that my mind can stop working for a few minutes and just rest. Before I go any further, I need to stop and be with you for a moment. If you are still here, if you have stayed through Block 1 and Block 2, and now you are here with me in my living room at 1 in the morning, I want you to know that means something to me. Tell me where you are listening from right now. What city? What state? What time of day is it where you are? And if this story is making you think about someone in your own life, someone who has been disappearing slowly, someone whose explanations are always reasonable and whose presence is always partial, leave a like. That small gesture tells me to keep going. Subscribe if you are not already here every day, because there is a new story waiting tomorrow and the day after and the day after that. Now let me take you to the next morning. Grace came downstairs at 7:15. I heard her before I saw her, the particular sound of her step on the 3rd stair from the bottom, which has always had a small creak in it that I have never repaired because over the years it became a kind of signal, a way of knowing she was coming. She was wearing the clean clothes I had brought her, a soft gray sweater and dark trousers, and her hair was down, and she had the look of someone who had slept a few hours and was not going to pretend it had been enough. I had coffee ready. I had made toast with the good bread from the bakery on Atwell's Avenue. I had not made anything elaborate because I understood that the morning required simplicity, that the wrong kind of effort can feel like pressure, and what Grace needed was a kitchen that asked nothing of her. She sat down and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at me. "Did you sleep?" she said. "A little," I said, which was not entirely true but was close enough. "Did you look at the documents?" "I looked at your timeline," I said. "I read my own notes. I thought about the next step." She nodded. "And?" "You need an attorney," I said. "Not a family attorney. Someone who specifically understands financial coercion. Someone who can look at those documents and tell you what your actual liability is and what your options are. Not what Caleb told you your options were. Your actual options." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I was afraid you were going to say I should go to the police." I said, "I am not saying you should not. I am saying the police is not the first door. The attorney is the first door. Because before you can talk to anyone about what happened, you need to understand what can be shown and what cannot. You need someone who works in this space, who knows what these documents mean legally, who can help you figure out what your signature actually obligated you to, and whether there is any argument that the obligation was obtained under conditions that undermine its validity." She looked at her toast. She said, "I did not know that was possible." I said, "I did not either. But I do not think we should assume it is not before we find someone who actually knows." That was the first thing I understood about the next step, that the most dangerous assumption we could make was the one Caleb had been cultivating in Grace for years, the assumption that the situation was already fixed, already settled, already past the point where anything could be changed. That is how a financial trap maintains itself. Not through locks, through the conviction of the person inside it that the lock is permanent. Later that morning, while Grace was in the shower, I called my friend Paulette. Paulette is 81 years old and has been retired for 12 years from a career in social work that spanned nearly 4 decades. She knows things about systems and services and the particular landscape of help available to people in difficult situations that most people do not know exist. She is not a person who panics. She is not a person who dramatizes. She is a person who listens and then says, with great precision, "Here is what I know, and here is who you should call." I told her the outline. I did not give her every detail. I gave her enough. And she was quiet for a moment after I finished, the way she is quiet when she is sorting information. And then she said, "There are attorneys who do this work. Family law with financial abuse components. There are also organizations specifically for this, not just domestic violence resources, but economic abuse resources, which is a category people do not know about until they need it. Let me make some calls this afternoon and get back to you. She called back at 2:17. She had two names. One was an attorney in Providence who had a specific practice area in financial coercion and had worked with other clients whose situations had involved documents signed under manipulative pressure. The other was a non-profit organization in the area that provided consultations to people navigating economic abuse, including help understanding legal documents and connecting with appropriate professional resources. I wrote both names in my notebook with the date and the time. Then I went upstairs and knocked on Grace's door and told her I had made some calls. She came out into the hallway and leaned against the wall, and I told her about Paulette and the two names. And something shifted in her face that I want to try to describe carefully because I think it matters. It was not relief exactly. Relief implies the danger is over. What I saw in her face was something smaller and more precise than relief. It was the expression of a person who has been told that the door they could not see might actually exist. It was the first reorganization of possibility after a long period of believing none was available. She said, "You called someone." I said, "I called Paulette." She said, "You did not call anyone in the family." I said, "No." She closed her eyes for a second. "Thank you," she said. That was the moment I want to give you as a lesson, because I think it contains something genuinely important. When someone is in a controlled situation, one of the most dangerous things a well-meaning person can do is immediately involve the broader family network without thinking about who in that network might be connected to the problem. Grace had specifically told me not to call anyone when she sent the location. She had a reason for that, a reason she had thought through carefully over 3 days alone in that room. She was not being paranoid, she was being precise. And the right response to that precision was not to override it because I thought I knew better. The right response was to honor it and work within its boundaries. This is something I wish more people understood about trying to help someone in a controlled or coercive situation. Your urgency does not override their strategy. Your love does not give you the right to make decisions they have not asked you to make. The most powerful thing you can often do is ask what they need, and then do that thing, and only that thing, at least at first. I want to pause here and breathe with you, because this is a heavy part of the story, and I do not want to rush past it. If you are here with me, if you have been listening to all of this, tell me something in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where you wanted to help someone but did not know the right way to do it without making it worse? Write the word "listen" if that sounds familiar. And if you are watching this on a device that has a subscribe button nearby, please press it. Come back tomorrow. There is more of this story to tell, and there is a lesson at the end of it that I think you are going to need. Now let me keep going. The attorney's name was Margaret Osei. She had an office on Westminster Street in Providence, on the 3rd floor of a building that had once been a textile company and still had the high ceilings and wide windows of its industrial past. Her office had good light, which Grace noticed immediately in the way that a person who thinks about space notices the quality of a room before anything else. She said later, quietly, that it was the first room she had sat in a long time that did not feel like it was trying to manage her. We went to see Margaret Osei on a Thursday, 2 days after Grace had come to Blackstone Grove. Grace brought the tote bag. Margaret Osei was in her mid-50s, composed and unhurried in a way that I associate with people who have spent decades dealing with situations where panic is already present and adding to it would serve no one. She shook our hands. She offered water. She sat behind a desk that was organized but not sterile, the kind of desk that has working paper on it, which is different from a desk arranged for the appearance of importance. She said, "Tell me everything. Take your time. I am not going anywhere." Grace told her everything. It took nearly 2 hours. Margaret Osei did not interrupt except to ask questions of clarification, and her questions were precise, the kind that showed she was tracking not just the facts, but the sequence, the logic, the internal architecture of how one thing had been designed to lead to another. She asked about the timeline of each signature. She asked about the context in which each document had been presented. She asked whether Grace had been given time to review anything before signing. She asked whether any of the documents had been notarized, and if so, under what circumstances. She asked about the relative and the nature of the information they had provided to Caleb. She made notes. Careful, specific notes. When Grace finished, Margaret Osei was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What you are describing is a pattern with a name. It is called economic abuse, and it is recognized in legal contexts more broadly now than it was even 5 years ago. The fact that the coercion was emotional rather than physical does not make it legally invisible. What it does mean is that documenting the pattern carefully, which it appears you have begun to do, is essential." She explained that the specific liability attached to each document would require careful analysis, that some of the signatures might have grounds for challenge depending on the circumstances of their execution, and that the business registration in Grace's name was a particularly significant concern that needed to be addressed with some urgency. She recommended that Grace not sign anything further under any circumstances. She recommended that Grace not contact Caleb without legal guidance on what to say. And she recommended that Grace not return to the shared home without a plan for what she needed to retrieve and how to do so safely. I took notes of my own on a small pad I had brought. At the end of the meeting, Margaret Osei looked at Grace and said something I want to share with you because I have thought about it many times since. She said, "You did not cause this by trusting someone. Trust is not a mistake. The mistake was his, not yours. And the process of getting out of this is going to feel slow and sometimes impossible, but it is a process that exists, and you are already further into it than you may realize. You made the timeline. You organized the documents. You called your mother. Those were not small things." Grace looked at the desk. Then she looked up and said, "He told me that if I tried to leave or dispute anything, everyone would think I was the one responsible. He said the paper trail pointed to me." Margaret Osei said, "That is a very common technique. It is designed to make you feel that the system will automatically believe the version of events he controls. But a paper trail can be read in more than one direction, and the sequence of events matters as much as the documents themselves. That is part of what we do." We left Westminster Street at 12:30 in the afternoon. The sun was out in the particular way that Providence March sun sometimes appears, low and determined, casting long shadows on the brick and creating a light that is more about angle than warmth. Grace stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her face turned toward it. She said, "That is the first time in a long time that someone in a professional context took what I said and did not immediately look for the reason it might be wrong." I thought about that on the drive home. About how much of the damage done to people in controlled situations is done not only by the person controlling them, but by all the peripheral moments when they tried to speak and were met with doubt, with reframing, with the subtle suggestion that their perception of their own experience was unreliable. Every time that happens, the wall gets a little higher. Every time a person says what they know and is told they are confused or dramatic or too emotional to see clearly, it becomes a little harder to trust the accuracy of their own account the next time. This is something I want every person listening to understand. When someone tells you something about their own life that sounds difficult or uncomfortable or inconvenient for the version of the story you already hold, the most powerful thing you can do is not immediately problem solve, not immediately verify, not immediately introduce doubt. The most powerful thing you can do is listen as if they are the expert on their own experience, because they are. They are the only expert that exists on what it feels like to be them inside the situation they are describing. We got home to Blackstone Grove at a little after 1. I made soup. Not because soup solves anything, but because my hands needed something useful to do, and because warmth in a bowl is something I know how to provide when I cannot yet provide anything else. Grace sat at the kitchen table and watched me cook, the way she used to when she was small, and would come and sit on the counter and ask questions about why things worked the way they did. Why does the onion change color? Why does the stalk get clearer as it reduces? Why does the bread rise? I always had answers because I had cooked long enough to understand the process, even when I could not always explain the science behind it. And she would listen and ask more questions, and I would answer them, and the kitchen would fill with the smell of something becoming what it was meant to be. She said, "What about the relative?" I did not turn from the stove. I said, "What about them?" She said, "Are you going to say something to them?" I kept stirring. I thought about it carefully before I answered, the way I have learned to think about things that matter before I speak. Then I said, "Not yet. Not without Margaret's guidance on how to approach it. Because right now, the most important thing is you, your legal situation, your safety, your next step. The relative is a separate question, and it has to wait until the first question is on its way to being answered." Grace was quiet. Then she said, "I was afraid you were going to be angry." I said, "I am angry. I am very angry. But anger is not the first tool we need right now." She looked at the table. She said, "That is one of the things he did, actually. He made me angry when he needed me to make decisions I would not otherwise make. He understood that if I was emotional, I was less likely to read things carefully." I turned around and looked at her. "Then we are going to be the opposite of that," I said. "We are going to be slow and careful and make no decisions we have not thought about twice. And we are going to document everything." She nodded. I turned back to the stove. The soup was almost ready. Outside the window, the oak tree in the front yard was doing what oak trees in Providence do in late March, beginning the very slow business of deciding whether spring has arrived yet, its branches still bare, but holding in them the entire green summer that was coming, patient as stone, sure of itself in a way that required no announcement. I thought about Grace at 32, sitting at my kitchen table, and I thought about myself at 32, which was 1979, which was a year I was feeding a toddler and managing a household and learning that my life was not going to look the way I had imagined it. And I thought about how every generation of women inherits a version of the same lesson dressed in different clothes. The lesson that the structures around you can look like support until the moment they become a cage. The lesson that love and control can share the same vocabulary for a surprisingly long time before the difference becomes impossible to ignore. I ladled the soup into 2 bowls. I brought them to the table. And we sat together in my kitchen on Blackstone Grove, my daughter and I, and we ate, and the light came in at the angle that late March light comes in, long and golden and a little tired. The way all light that has traveled a long way is a little tired by the time it arrives. That was the beginning of the slow work. I want to tell you something about slow work before I describe what it looked like in practice. We live in a time that is very uncomfortable with slowness. We expect resolution to arrive at the pace of a screen refreshing, to be clean and complete, and arrived at without the long, uncomfortable middle stretch where nothing is certain and everything requires patience. We want the moment of confrontation, the moment of revelation, the moment where the truth enters the room and changes everything in a single breath. And sometimes life does give you those moments, but more often, real change is made of mornings. It is made of phone calls and appointments and the careful reading of documents that are boring and consequential and require attention even when attention is the last thing you have to give. It is made of sitting in an attorney's office on a Thursday and coming back the following Thursday and the Thursday after that. It is made of keeping a notebook. I want to tell you that clearly because I think the version of justice that people sometimes imagine, swift and cinematic and complete, can actually discourage people from beginning the slow work. If the only resolution that feels real is the dramatic one, then the small, careful steps toward actual stability can feel like they do not count. They do count. They count enormously. They are, in fact, the only thing that produces anything lasting. Grace stayed with me on Blackstone Grove. She had gone back to the shared home once on a Saturday morning, with Margaret Osei's guidance on what to take and what to leave and what not to touch. She had brought her professional documents, her personal identification, her laptop, a specific external hard drive that contained backups of her client files and her grandmother's ring, which had been on the nightstand and which she had put in her coat pocket and walked out with as if it were nothing, which took a kind of composure I thought about for days afterward. She did not take more than she needed. She did not leave a note. She called Margaret's office from the parking lot of a pharmacy 3 blocks away and said she was out, and Margaret's assistant said good, and Grace drove to Blackstone Grove and sat in my car in the driveway for a few minutes before she came inside. She told me later that she had sat in the car because she needed to experience the feeling of being somewhere she had chosen without anyone's permission. That the driveway of my house was the first place in a long time where the decision to stop had been entirely hers. I want to pause here because I want you to stay with me through this part. We are getting close to something. Not a dramatic confrontation, something more honest than that. Something that requires you to be paying attention. If you are here, leave a like right now. It helps more people find this story, and some of those people may be sitting in a driveway somewhere, or a parking lot, or a room with the curtains drawn, and they need to know that the slow work is real and that it leads somewhere. Subscribe if you are not already. Come back tomorrow. There is more waiting. Now let me take you to the Thursday that changed things. 3 weeks after Room 12, Margaret Osei requested a meeting. She had been analyzing the documents Grace had brought, consulting with a colleague who specialized in business fraud, and she had reached the point where she could give us a clearer picture of the actual situation than we had had before. Grace and I arrived at the Westminster Street office on a Thursday morning in early April. The light was better that day than it had been in March. The trees on Westminster were beginning to think about opening. Margaret Osei waited until we were both seated, and then she laid it out. The loans in Grace's name totaled an amount I will not specify, but that was significant. Some of them had documentation issues, meaning that the circumstances of their execution raised questions about whether the proper process had been followed. 2 of them had signatures that were dated on days when Margaret's colleague, after reviewing Grace's calendar and credit card records, could demonstrate that Grace had been at a documented client site meeting, raising questions about whether she had physically been present when the documents said she was. The business registration was more complicated, but there were grounds to challenge the circumstances under which it had been filed, particularly given the relative's involvement, which had now been documented through a chain of emails that Grace had found in a cloud backup she had not realized she still had access to. Margaret Osei said, "None of this is simple. None of it is fast. But I want you to understand that the narrative that you were a willing and informed participant in these transactions is not the only narrative that can be constructed from these documents. There is another narrative, one that shows a pattern of information being gathered by a third party and used to position you for signatures that were obtained under conditions of emotional coercion and informational asymmetry. That narrative is buildable, and I think it is the true one." Grace was very still. Then she said, "What about the relative?" Margaret Osei said, "That is where it becomes more complicated. The relative's involvement, if it can be fully demonstrated, changes the character of the situation significantly. It suggests that this was not simply a husband exploiting a wife's trust, but a coordinated effort involving someone with detailed knowledge of your professional and personal vulnerabilities. That is a different kind of matter." She paused and looked at Grace directly. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly and without thinking about what the answer should be. Do you believe the relative knew what the information they were providing would be used for?" Grace looked at the desk for a long moment. Then she said, "Yes." She did not elaborate immediately. Margaret waited, and Grace said, "There was a conversation, about 8 months ago. I was at my mother's house for a Sunday dinner, and the relative was there. And after dinner, when I was helping clear the plates, the relative said something to me that I did not understand at the time. They said, 'You should be careful about how exposed you are professionally,' as if they already knew something was coming, as if they were giving me a warning they could not give me clearly, because giving it clearly would have required admitting what they knew." The room was quiet. I remembered that Sunday dinner. I had not been close enough to hear that exchange. I had been in the kitchen. I remembered the relative helping carry dishes in and Grace following with the serving bowl, and I had thought nothing of it because it looked like every other Sunday. It looked like family. Margaret Osei made a note. She said, "That detail is important. If it can be corroborated, if anyone else was present, or if there is any other evidence that the relative had foreknowledge, it strengthens the picture considerably." I said from my chair in the corner, "I have notes." Both of them looked at me. I said, "I have been keeping a notebook since January. I have dated entries. I have observations about Grace's behavior over time. I have the date of that Sunday dinner. I may not have the specifics of the conversation, but I have documentation that the dinner occurred and that both Grace and the relative were present." Margaret Osei looked at me for a moment with an expression that I recognized because I have lived long enough to see it on the faces of professionals who have been dealing with people who arrive without evidence, and then someone produces something they were not expecting. She said, "Can you bring the notebook to our next meeting?" I said yes. I brought it the following Thursday. And something happened in that second meeting that I want to describe to you carefully, because it is the thing I think about most when I think about what it means to bear witness. Margaret's colleague, the business fraud specialist, was present at that second meeting. His name was David Nkrumah, and he had a quiet, thorough manner and eyes that moved quickly when he was reading. He took my notebook and he read it with a patience that suggested he had read many notebooks over the course of his career, many collections of small observations by people who had been paying attention to something before they understood exactly what it was. He read for about 20 minutes. Grace and I drank water and did not speak. Then he looked up and said, "The timeline you kept is consistent with and in some places predictive of the document dates we have been examining. There are entries here that place behavioral changes in Grace at specific times that correlate precisely with points at which documents were being executed. That kind of independent contemporaneous record is valuable because it cannot be constructed after the fact." He looked at me directly. "Did you know you were building a record?" I said, "I knew I was paying attention to something I could not yet name." He nodded, as if that was the correct answer. It was in that meeting that the picture became fully clear to me for the first time. Not just the facts of what had happened, but the shape of it, the full design. Grace had been selected, which is the word David Nkrumah used, and which I have not been able to put down since I heard it. Not randomly victimized, selected, because she had the right combination of a successful professional reputation, a willingness to trust people she loved, a business structure that could be used, and a family network that included someone with detailed access to her vulnerabilities who was willing to make that access available. The design had been patient and deliberate, and it had worked for as long as it had worked because every individual piece of it had a reasonable explanation, and the only way to see the whole structure was to step far enough back to see all the pieces at once. My notebook had helped step back far enough. I want to give you the lesson that came from that room because I think it is one of the most practically important things I have ever learned. Keep records. Not because you are suspicious, not because you expect the worst, but because memory is not enough when you need to demonstrate a pattern. Memory fades, reorders, softens, gets challenged. A dated entry in a plain notebook does not. It sits there patient as stone, carrying the exact observation from the exact date, and when someone needs to understand what happened and in what order, it gives them something to hold. Write things down. The small observations, the changed behaviors, the words someone used that seemed slightly off, the canceled plans, the shifts in tone. Write them down with dates in plain language and keep them somewhere they cannot be easily accessed by the people you are observing. Not because you are building a case, because if you ever need a case, you will already have begun it without knowing it. That is what I had done, without fully knowing why. And it turned out to matter in ways I could not have anticipated when I was writing, alone in my kitchen at night, about an unfinished cup of coffee and a scarf left on a chair. 3 days after the second meeting with Margaret Osei, Caleb made contact. Not with Grace directly. He had been told through Margaret's office that all communication needed to go through legal representation, and he had acknowledged that. He made contact through the relative. The relative called my house on a Monday afternoon, and I answered. I want to tell you what that phone call was like, because it illustrates something I think is important to understand about the way people who have been operating inside a deceptive system respond when the system begins to be examined. They do not, as a rule, immediately confess. They do not crumble. What they do, typically, is perform normalcy with slightly too much effort. They call in a regular voice about a regular thing, and they circle toward what they actually want without approaching it directly, hoping that the normalcy of the performance will create enough ambient trust that the actual request, when it comes, will seem like a reasonable thing from a reasonable person. The relative talked to me for 11 minutes about ordinary matters, the weather, a neighbor's renovation, a recipe they had been meaning to share. And then, with what I can only describe as a practiced casualness, they said, I hear Grace has been having a hard time. I hope she is doing all right. You know Caleb is very worried about her. I said, I will let her know you called. The relative said, Is she staying with you? Maybe I should stop by. I said, That will not be necessary right now. There was a pause. The relative said, Marilyn, I hope we are not going to make this into something bigger than it needs to be. I said, I do not know what you mean. Another pause. Then, family is family. I just hope everyone keeps that in mind. I said, I appreciate the call. I will tell Grace you asked about her. And I ended the conversation. I wrote down the time, the date, and every word I could remember in my notebook within 5 minutes of hanging up the phone. Then I called Margaret Osie's office and described the call. She said, Do not be surprised if there are more. The goal of those calls is to establish that everything is normal, that this is just a family misunderstanding, and to gather information about what you know and what you are doing. Say as little as possible. Write down everything immediately afterward. I did exactly that. There were 2 more calls over the following week. From the relative. The tone shifted gradually from warmth to subtle pressure, from gentle inquiry to something that had the faint shape of a warning wrapped in the language of concern. I wrote down every call. I gave every record to Margaret's office. Grace did not take any of those calls. She had decided, with Margaret's guidance, that her communication with both Caleb and the relative would be entirely managed through legal channels for the time being. It was one of the hardest decisions she made, she told me later, not because she was tempted to call them, but because there was a particular kind of discipline required in not responding to people who were trying to pull a response from her, people who were counting on her eventual exhaustion or guilt or family loyalty to create an opening. She held the discipline. And in the holding of it, something I had not expected happened. She got stronger. Not the kind of strong that announces itself, the quiet kind. The kind that arrives when a person has been making careful decisions for long enough that the making of careful decisions starts to feel like the natural condition of being alive rather than an enormous, effortful departure from it. She started sleeping better. I know because the 3rd stair from the bottom stopped creaking at 2 a.m, which is when she had been going down to sit in the kitchen in the dark in those first weeks, unable to settle. The creak started happening only once in the morning, around 7, which meant she was sleeping through to morning and coming down at a reasonable hour in a reasonable frame of mind. She started working again, carefully, on a limited basis, on 2 small projects with clients who had been asking for her for months. She worked at my kitchen table with her laptop and her drawing tools and occasionally a cup of tea going cold beside her because she had forgotten it was there, which was a sure sign that she was actually working and not performing the act of working, because forgetting the tea is something that only happens when the work has taken over properly. She started looking at the window again. I know that sounds like a small thing, but I had been watching her not look at windows for the better part of a year, watching her exist in rooms as if the outside of those rooms was something to be managed rather than encountered. When she started sitting near the windows on Blackstone Grove and letting her eyes go to the yard, to the oak tree, to the particular quality of spring light that was arriving now in earnest, golden and longer each day, I understood that something fundamental was reorganizing itself in her. She was beginning to live in space again instead of just occupying it. I want to close this block by telling you about the Sunday that happened 6 weeks after Room 12. It was a Sunday in late April, and I had made pasta with the long, slow sauce, and Grace had helped, standing at the counter chopping the aromatics with the same precision she brings to everything she does with her hands. The kitchen was warm and smelled of garlic and tomato and the rosemary from the plant in the window that had survived the winter and was coming back bolder than before. We did not have any guests that Sunday. We sat at the table that had held so many Sunday dinners, the table where I had watched her disappear slowly over the previous year, and we ate, and we talked about things that had nothing to do with documents or attorneys or the telephone calls that had now gone quiet. We talked about a building she had seen on College Hill that she thought had been restored badly and could have been done so much better. We talked about what Walter would have thought of all of this, which led us to laughing in that specific way that grief sometimes produces, the laughter that is real and also contains everything that the laughter is built over. After dinner, when I was doing the dishes, Grace came and stood beside me and picked up a dish towel and dried the plates as I washed them, the way she had done since she was old enough to reach the counter. She said, "I want to tell you something." I handed her a plate. She said, "The night I sent you the location, I almost did not send it. I almost decided I would handle it alone. I had this idea that asking for help meant I had not been strong enough, that needing a witness was the same as admitting I had failed at something." I handed her another plate. "What changed your mind?" I said. She dried the plate slowly. She said, "I thought about what it would mean if no one knew. If I handled it alone and something happened, or if I handled it alone and nothing happened. Either way, I would have been the only person who held the whole truth of what had occurred. And that felt like a particular kind of loneliness I was not willing to choose." I turned off the water. I turned and looked at her. I said, "You chose right." She folded the dish towel over the rack and said, "I know." Outside the kitchen window, the oak tree was fully leafed now, green and certain, doing what it had done every April for as long as I had lived in that house, filling in the view from the window with the quiet insistence of something that has survived enough winters to be entirely sure of spring. If you are still here with me, if you have been present through all of this, I want you to know that what comes next matters. The story is not finished. But what I need you to do right now is this. Leave a like if any part of this has reached something in you. Write the word "listen" if you have ever needed a witness and did not know how to ask for one. Subscribe so you are here tomorrow, because the last part of this story is where the lesson lands, and it is worth waiting for. Tell me where you are. What city? What time? I am listening. From Blackstone Grove, from my kitchen that still smells of rosemary and long, slow sauce, I am listening to all of you. 6 months is not a long time in the life of a legal process. But it is a long time in the life of a person who has spent years inside a controlled situation and is now, for the first time in memory, making decisions that belong entirely to herself. 6 months is long enough to begin to understand what freedom actually feels like when it is not dramatic, when it does not arrive with a fanfare or a clean resolution, but simply accumulates quietly in the corners of ordinary days until one morning you wake up and realize that the weight you had been carrying so long, you forgot it was weight, has become, at some point you cannot pinpoint exactly, lighter. It was October when I sat down to think about everything that had happened since that Tuesday in March. The oak tree in the front yard had turned the particular color it turns in Providence in October, a deep amber with traces of rust at the edges of each leaf, the color of something that has decided to be beautiful one last time before it lets go. I was sitting in the chair by the front window with my coffee, the good morning cup, the one that I allow myself to take slowly without any task attached to it, and I was watching the light move across the yard in that long October way, and I was thinking about Grace. She was not in my house that morning. She had been in my house for 9 weeks, and then she had moved to a small apartment on the east side of Providence, a 1-bedroom on the 2nd floor of a building that had a good eastern window in the kitchen, which she had mentioned first when she described the apartment to me, before she mentioned the rent or the neighborhood or any of the practical details. She had said, "The kitchen has a good eastern window," and I had understood that the apartment was the right one. She had taken very little with her from the shared home, and she had bought almost nothing new for the apartment. What she had done instead was arrange with great care and deliberateness the things she already owned, the things she had been making do without for months, the drawing tools and the books, and a small lamp she had bought herself years ago before she married, and the grandmother's ring which now lived on a different finger than the one it had been on before. She had made the space hers the way she knew how to make a space someone's, not by filling it, but by understanding what each part of it wanted to be and allowing it to be that. I had visited on the 2nd Saturday after she moved in. She made coffee. We sat at her small table by that eastern window, and the morning light came in at the angle morning light comes in when the window faces east in October, gold and clear and without apology, and Grace was wearing her own clothes in her own apartment, in her own light, and she looked like herself. Not the self of the past 2 years, the deeper self, the one I had recognized for 32 years, the one that had been present underneath the controlled version, waiting with the patience of someone who knew that a room can be reorganized without being destroyed. Before I tell you where things stood legally and practically by October, I want to tell you something that happened at St. Augustine's in September, because I think it belongs to this story in a way that I could not have predicted. I had been going to Sunday services throughout the spring and summer, as I always do, and one Sunday in September, a woman sat beside me in my usual pew who I did not recognize. She was perhaps 65, well-dressed, with the quiet, composed manner of someone who was holding something carefully. We exchanged the small courtesies of the service and did not speak otherwise. But afterward, in the hall where people gather for coffee, she approached me and said she had heard I might know something about the resources available to people dealing with financial difficulties inside family situations. I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Who told you that?" She said that Paulette, my friend of many years, had mentioned my name carefully and with permission, knowing that I had recently been through something that had taught me things about navigation that I had not known before. I said, "Tell me what you are dealing with. I will tell you what I know." We talked for 40 minutes in that church hall with the coffee going cold in our cups. Her situation was different from Grace's in its specifics, but recognizable in its architecture. A family member. A gradual accumulation of agreements that had not been fully understood. A growing sense of being trapped without a visible trap. A fear that speaking would only make the situation worse because the paper trail seemed to point in the wrong direction. I gave her Margaret Osie's name. I gave her the name of the non-profit organization Paulette had found. I told her to start writing things down immediately, with dates in plain language, and to keep the notebook somewhere that was only hers. I told her that the process was slow, and that slowness was not the same as failure. I told her that the most important thing she could do first was find one person who would listen without immediately trying to manage what she said. She thanked me and shook my hand and walked to her car in the parking lot. I stood in the doorway of St. Augustine's and watched her go, and I thought about the location Grace had sent me in March, and about the particular courage it takes to send a location instead of disappearing, and about how far a single act of reaching out can travel if the person who receives it responds with patience rather than panic. I want to pause here and be with you for a moment, because we are near the end of this story, and I do not want to rush the ending. Some stories are worth slowing down for. This is one of them. If you are still here, if you have been present through all 5 parts of this telling, I want you to do something for me right now. Leave a like. Not because I am asking you to perform an action. Because if this story has given you something, if it has put language around something you already felt, or shone a light on something you had been trying to see, then that like is a way of saying so, and I would like to know. Subscribe if you want to be here tomorrow, because there is always another story, and some of them are going to arrive on the exact day you need them. And tell me where you are watching from. What city, what time of day, what kind of light is coming through your window right now? I am genuinely asking. I read those comments like letters from people I may never meet, but already feel connected to. Now let me finish this. By October, the legal situation had reached a stage that Margaret Osei described as materially clarified, which is attorney language for the fact that the picture was now clear enough to act on, even though the acting would still take time. 2 of the 4 loans had documentation sufficient to raise a formal challenge based on the circumstances of their execution, including the corroborating evidence from Grace's calendar showing her location on the days the documents claimed she had signed them in person. The business registration had been identified as potentially fraudulent based on the evidence of the relatives' coordinated involvement, and this matter had been referred to an additional professional for assessment. The remaining financial entanglements were complex, but not insurmountable, and Margaret had a clear strategy for addressing them in sequence. The relative had stopped calling. The calls had ceased entirely about 3 weeks after the last one I had documented, which was also approximately the time that Margaret's office made formal contact with the relative's attorney, because by that point the relative had retained one. The fact of retaining an attorney told its own story, and it was a story that Margaret Osei and David Nkrumah read carefully and added to the file. Caleb had made 2 attempts to contact Grace directly, both in violation of the legal guidance his own attorney had presumably given him, and both of which had been documented and communicated to the appropriate party. He had stopped after the second one. Whether this was because his attorney had finally gotten through to him, or because he had understood that every attempt at direct contact was being recorded and added to a growing picture, I cannot say. What I can say is that the silence, when it finally arrived, felt different from the silence Grace had been living inside during their marriage. That silence had been the silence of something controlled. This silence was the silence of something losing its hold. Grace's business was still small and carefully managed, but it was operating. She had taken on 3 clients since September, all of them people who had worked with her before and had been waiting for her availability with the particular loyalty that good professional relationships sometimes produce. She was working in a way that was slower than before, but more deliberate, making choices about which projects to take and which to decline, learning the difference between work that fed her and work that only kept her occupied. She called me every few days, not every day. Every few days, which felt right, which felt like the rhythm of 2 people who live separate lives that belong to each other at the edges. One afternoon she called and said, "I have been thinking about the coat." I said, "What coat?" She said, "The coat I was wearing in room 12, the big one. It belonged to him. I had taken it because the night I left, I grabbed the nearest coat and it happened to be his. I had been carrying it around in the back of my car for months without thinking about it. And last week I realized it was there and I took it to a donation bin." I said, "How did that feel?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Like setting something down that I had been holding for so long, I had stopped noticing it was in my hands." I have thought about that image many times. The thing held so long you stop noticing it is weight, because that is what coercive control does over time. It does not announce itself as a burden. It integrates itself so thoroughly into the texture of a life that it begins to feel like the natural condition of being alive, rather than a structure that has been built around you by someone with a specific intention. And the moment of setting it down, when it finally comes, is not always dramatic. Sometimes it is a coat in a donation bin. Sometimes it is the first morning you sleep through to 7. Sometimes it is forgetting a cup of tea because the work has taken over properly. I want to give you the full lesson now because I think you have earned it by staying through this story, and because I believe some of you listening tonight need to hear it said plainly. If you are watching someone you love disappear slowly, someone whose explanations are always reasonable and whose presence is always partial, someone who holds their phone differently and eats a little less and cancels plans without alternatives. Do not wait for certainty before you pay attention. Certainty is rarely available before damage is done. What you have is patterns. Pay attention to patterns. Write them down with dates. Keep them in a place that is only yours. And when the person is ready to reach out, be the kind of presence that they can reach toward without fear of being managed, redirected, or doubted. If you are the person inside the situation, the person who has been signing things one at a time and believing the reasonable explanations and carrying a coat that was never yours, I want to tell you what Grace taught me by sending that location. Asking for help is not the same as admitting failure. Needing a witness is not weakness. The act of reaching out, however small, however carefully worded, however disguised as just a location on a map, is one of the bravest things a human being can do when they have been living inside a structure designed to make them believe that reaching out will only make things worse. It will not make things worse. It will make things visible. And visibility, however uncomfortable, is always the beginning of something better than staying hidden. If you are an older person, someone who has been quietly managing a situation because you do not want to make trouble or burden anyone or be seen as someone who cannot handle their own affairs, I want to speak to you directly. Your dignity matters. Your account of your own experience matters. Your instinct, that deep, patient instinct that decades of living produces in people who have been paying attention, that instinct is not your age speaking against you. It is your intelligence speaking for you. Do not let anyone call it confusion. Do not let anyone call it overreaction. Write things down. Find one person who will listen. Take the next step, not the whole solution, just the next step, and let that step lead to the one after it. And if you are someone who has dismissed a concern raised by an older person in your family who has said she is just getting dramatic, or he is imagining things, or they do not understand how the modern world works, I am asking you gently but plainly to reconsider. The people who have lived the longest have seen the most patterns. They are often the first to notice when something is wrong. Their discomfort with a situation may be the clearest signal available that the situation deserves examination. Listen before you dismiss. Ask before you reassure. Slow down before you explain away. These are the things I know now that I did not know on the morning of that Tuesday in March when I stood at my sink with my hands damp from the china and my phone lit up with a pin on a map and 4 sentences from a daughter who needed a witness. I know that love is not enough by itself. Love without attentiveness is comfort without protection. Love without the willingness to hear difficult things is warmth without honesty. Love without the courage to take a slow, careful step toward a person who is disappearing is sentiment without substance. I know that the slow work is the real work, that the notebook matters, that the dated entry about a canceled dinner or a scarf left on a chair or a phone held face down can become, months later, part of the record that helps a person get their life back. I know that systems are imperfect and processes are slow, and justice does not always arrive on time or in the shape we imagined. But I also know that the people inside those systems, the attorneys and the social workers and the nonprofit counselors and the colleagues who specialize in the specific intersection of family and finance and coercion, those people are real and they are working and they can help if you find them. And finding them begins with one phone call to one person who knows one name. I know that a family is not made safe by its appearance. A table that seats 10 people on a Sunday does not prove that all 10 of those people are looking out for each other. What makes a family safe is not the gathering, but the honesty inside it, the willingness to say when something is wrong, the refusal to maintain a comfortable fiction at the cost of someone's dignity. And I know that a daughter who sends her mother a location on a Tuesday evening at 6:42 is not asking to be rescued. She is asking to be believed. She is asking for a witness. She is asking for the particular kind of love that can sit quietly across a table in a room with a yellow-edged lampshade and hear the full account without trying to make it smaller or more manageable or less inconvenient. She is asking for a mother. And the most important thing I did in all of this, more important than the notebook, more important than calling Paulette, more important than sitting in Margaret Osei's office on Westminster Street, was simply this. I drove to the Bayfront Motor Lodge on a Tuesday evening in March. I walked to the end of the parking lot. I knocked twice on the door of room 12. And when the door opened, I came in and closed it behind me, and I sat down and I said, "Tell me everything, from the beginning, slowly. I am not going anywhere." That was all it took to begin. Not heroism, not perfect knowledge, not the right strategy fully formed from the first moment. Just presence. Just the willingness to drive to the place where someone you love is waiting and to be fully and completely there. I want to close by going back to something. The dish rack on the counter in my kitchen on Blackstone Grove. The good china still sitting there. The phone that lit up before I expected it to. The soup bowl in my hands when I read those 4 sentences. I left the bowl on the counter. I left the kitchen light on. I picked up my coat and I went. And now it is October, and the oak tree has turned amber, and the apartment on the east side has a good eastern window, and my daughter is working at a table in her own light. And there is a notebook under my bread box that is more full now than it was in January, full of a different kind of entry. Not the careful, worried observations of a mother tracking the slow disappearance of someone she loves, but the ordinary notations of a life that has turned a corner and is finding its way forward. One careful, deliberate step at a time. The scarf that Grace left on my dining room chair in January is still there. I have decided to leave it, not because I have forgotten it, because it reminds me of the in-between time, the months when I was carrying a concern I could not yet name. And I want to remember what it felt like to carry something that heavy, without knowing exactly what it was, so that I never again tell myself or anyone else that a feeling which arrives without a full explanation is not worth taking seriously. A feeling that arrives without explanation is often the most serious kind. Pay attention to it. Write it down. Drive to the parking lot. Knock twice. That is the lesson. That is the whole lesson. And if you take one thing from this story, take that. Take the image of a woman of 78 years putting down a soup bowl and picking up her coat and going, without certainty, without a plan, without anything except the knowledge that someone she loved had sent her a location and asked her to come. Take that image and carry it into your own life and the lives of the people around you, and when someone sends you their location, in whatever form that takes, in whatever language the particular desperation of their moment allows them to use, go. Just go. Before I leave you, I need to tell you how grateful I am. Grateful that you stayed through all 5 parts of this story. Grateful that you gave your time and your attention to the telling of something that is not simple and does not resolve cleanly and does not offer easy comfort. Grateful that you are the kind of person who wants to understand things more deeply than the surface allows. That is not a small thing. In a world that moves very fast and prefers its stories brief and its lessons simple, the willingness to sit with something long and complicated and human is an act of courage in its own quiet way. If this story gave you something, please leave a like. That small action helps more people find what you found here today, and some of those people may need it in ways that neither of us can fully imagine. If you have not subscribed yet, I am asking you from the heart to do it now. There is a new story here every single day, told with the same care and the same commitment to honesty and educational value that I hope you felt in this one. Come back tomorrow. Come back the day after. Bring someone with you who might need to sit with a story like this one. Leave a comment and tell me where you are watching from. What city, what state, what country, what time of day it is there, whether it is morning or evening, or the particular quiet of the middle of the night when the stories that matter most find their way to the people who most need them. I read every single one of those comments. I carry them with me the way I carry postcards from people I may never meet but already know something true about. And if this story touched something in you, If it put language around something you had been feeling without words, write the word safe in the comments. Just that one word. Not because everything is resolved or simple or fully healed, but because safety begins when somebody finally pays attention. Because safety begins when someone drives to the parking lot. Because safety begins when a mother picks up her coat and goes without waiting for certainty. Write safe. And share this with someone who needs a gentle reminder that the instinct they have been second-guessing might be the most honest thing they know. From my kitchen on Blackstone Grove, from the chair by the window where the October light is doing what October light does in Providence, from the woman who stood at a dish rack on a Tuesday evening and chose to go, I am wishing you all of the things that matter most. Clarity when the picture is confusing, courage when the step feels impossible, patience when the work is slow, and always, always, someone who will come when you send them your location. Take care of the people who trust you. That is everything. That is all I know.